What do stories call us to do or to be? What helped me answer this question for myself this week was, no surprise, a story. Several years ago, my wife Erin went on a pilgrimage to Israel, Palestine, with a group of other Christian church disciples of Christ, seminarians and ministers. One stop on their journey was a Palestinian refugee camp, where they met with a woman who told her story of living there for years, making a home, raising her family. It was a story of the trials and tribulations of her life and oppression by the Israeli government. She told her story to entreat others to donate their time and money to the cause and to educate others about her situation. It touched the hearts of many of those who listened, and it helped them to better understand the dynamics of what's happening in Israel, Palestine. After they left the refugee camp, one of the trip organizers said that he had been taking groups to this same refugee camp for years and meeting with this same woman, and had heard her recount the same story over and over again, almost word for word. The purpose of this trip was to hear the stories of people in the region, but this encounter left Erin wondering how many of these stories are told and retold in this way, becoming essential to the collective memory that's passed along. It also left her wondering, when we tell our stories over and over again, whether we might get stuck in them. As I reflected on the call of stories this week, I realized that since change is a constant in life, stories call us to change, to be transformed, to act, and to move beyond the reality described in our story. Telling our stories is not an end in itself. When we tell a story about ourselves or our community, we're called to continue living and growing beyond it. Stories call us to transformation because of their power to humanize and to dehumanize. They connect us with other people and remind us of our shared humanity. They touch core vulnerabilities, our deepest truths and questions, while also lifting us beyond our individual selves. Stories remind us that we're part of what Wendell Berry calls the grand liturgy of the universe, or what Unitarian Universalists might call the interdependent web. Stories nurture connections, our sense that our fates are linked to other people and to the earth, and that our stories help to shape the world. This is the incredible power of story. Stories also call us to responsibility. When we listen to someone's story, we hold it, and we're shaped by what we learn from it. When we hear human stories of pain and struggle, or when we hear stories of engagement in social movements or issues, this moves us to act for change and to find our place in that ever-growing story. Listening to the story from the woman in the Palestinian refugee camp caused some in the group to be more selective and critical about the media coverage of the conflict there. It enabled them to approach the situation with a more informed view, and it also led some of them to be more outspoken and active and to go home and educate their own churches about the complexities of the conflict. Stories are not simply information or data. Stories are, in the words of social researcher Brene Brown, data with a soul. They bring data down to a human level that we can connect with. In fact, stories activate our brains in entirely different ways than data or pure information. The power of the story is that it makes sense of ideas that are not meaningfully conveyed in a cut and dry manner. We record and communicate the most important things about being human through the medium of stories. This is why all of the world's religions are made up of them. A story is quite a bit more compelling usually than a list of beliefs or principles or commandments or virtues. Jesus and the Buddha conveyed their most profound teachings in the form of parables. Hindu stories have messages about God that are accessible to young and old alike. And religious stories are not, they're about ordinary things, animals, nature, people, agriculture, not explicitly about God or matters of religion, but they connect to our hearts and our spirits. And it's through stories that religion moves people to devotion, to service, and to living moral and ethical lives. Information or data alone is also not always a sufficient motivator for social engagement either. We can hear endless statistics about the unemployment rate or the percentage of children living in poverty or the increases in greenhouse gas emissions, and this information certainly helps us to understand the problem, but information alone can be overwhelming or too abstract. It doesn't connect us with other people. Stories give what may seem like unwieldy problems a human face and bring them down to a manageable scale. This is why it is important to share our stories of life and of social engagement. I can think of numerous times that I've been inspired listening to a personal story to give my time and money to some cause. This is often what moves us to give generously during our first Sunday offertory to some local organization that aligns with our values. It's important to think about, why do we give our time and money to certain causes? It's probably because you heard a story, or you have some personal connection to the cause or the issue that they focus on. Our political leaders know how effective stories are. For example, at every State of the Union address, the president always invites some guests of honor to sit up in the balcony with the First Lady. And these are ordinary people, military service members, small business owners, immigrants, not wealthy or powerful people. And when it comes time, he points up to the balcony and the people there and he says, "I recently met Jane Smith, a small business owner in Indiana." Or he says, "This is the story of so-and-so who came to the United States to go to college." He does this to illustrate whatever his next point is about giving tax breaks to small business owners or about immigration reform, and to bring the issue down to a human level that the American people that we can connect with. When the president weaves the stories of Americans into his speeches, I think he's also inviting us to see the impact that changes in policy and priorities can have. Individual uplift is not always enough. We need to change our systems and our society. Hearing the stories of others calls us often to transformation and to action, but so can telling our own stories. When I was a youth growing up at the First Unitarian Universalist Society in Albany, New York, one of our favorite community building activities, which we probably did yearly, was to share our scar stories. I still remember some of these stories 14 years or more later. They're about falling off bikes, car accidents, sports injuries, illness, violence. I always told about the prominent scar on my right knee, which I got when I was 10 years old and my knee went through a glass-paned door. Each of these stories that was told conveys something about the person, their family, their interests, and their struggles. Sharing and listening to these scar stories helped us to understand and to connect with one another. It helped us to acknowledge that we're all wounded in some way, and sometimes it allowed us to be there in support of members of the group whose scars were not from long ago, but were the outward sign of something that had happened more recently. Something as simple as a scar story could lead to individual and community bonding and change. The men in our reading this morning told their stories of their childhood, when they ceased to be a child, and what is important to them. They told about their lives now in prison and the stories that they had been told by their families. And through telling these stories, they became visible. As the author says, they became more than their worst things, which is what many people would look at them as prisoners and see. Together, they show each other compassion, they seek to identify what matters, to discover something something to draw upon in hard times, to grapple with what they've done and own their responsibility, and to push on. I am here in the name of story and its power to transform, says the author Helen Elaine Lee. And indeed, this reading shows story's power to do just that, both for her writing students and for herself. A couple weeks ago at the summer lunch program here at church, we heard from Chad Harbor, a local man who writes people's memoirs. He listens to and collects stories from people's lives and weaves them together into a narrative that can then be passed along to future generations. In telling stories about ourselves, we communicate what we want others to know and to understand about us, or our community, or our vocation, our loves and our struggles, what matters to us, basically. It's more than just dates and data. It has a soul. And this is why he writes people's memoirs, to make stories available to future generations in a way that is meaningful and that changes people's lives. It's an interesting exercise to reflect on what stories you would tell about yourself for a memoir. How would you convey the soul of your life? And how would you communicate what is most important to you that you want to pass along? Memoir writing and oral history is one form of personal storytelling, and another is testimony. Black liberation theologian James Cone says that testimony is used in churches not only to strengthen an individual's faith, but also to build the faith of the community. Now, you may think of testimony as something that we see more often in Christian churches, when members get up to talk about their faith and the role that God has had in their lives. But we too use testimony in this church, when members share during worship about why being part of this church is important to them and what impact it's made on their life. Reflecting on the church's importance can be an empowering and a strengthening experience, both for the storyteller and for the listeners. Our willingness to share invites others to do the same, thereby building the faith of our community. Telling our stories creates a narrative that helps us define ourselves. I'm a lifelong UU. I'm a vegetarian. I'm a Mac user. I'm a dog person. I'm an Enneagram type 9, the peacemaker. I'm a Myers-Briggs type ISFJ. These narratives can help us to live more fully into who we are, but they can also limit us. The same goes for other narratives that we tell. What is the story we tell about this church or about Unitarian Universalism? There's a danger in having one single story or narrative because people and communities are complex and multi-layered. A single narrative can be exclusionary or an excuse for refusing to adapt or change. Our personal narratives often change. Our political views might evolve over our lifetimes. Our relationships with family or our economic situation or our career might change, and therefore the stories that we tell about ourselves change as well. Sometimes we tell a story over and over again, like the Palestinian woman did, and it becomes an essential part of who we are, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. We get stuck. Maybe the Palestinian woman felt stuck in her story. Maybe she told it over and over again in hope that after hearing it, others would also work for change. Rachel Freed, who is a writer that helps people reflect on their legacies, says that we tell our stories in an attempt to release ourselves from them. In other words, the purpose of storytelling is to transcend or to move beyond a story that may have imprisoned us to live out more of our potential. Telling our stories is not an end in itself. Each of us has many stories, but perhaps we have one powerful story that we think best defines our life. We also have stories about our relationships with other people. It may have to do with how we met or some big experience or life adventure we had together or what we share in common. Since I'm at an age where many of my friends are getting married, I visited a lot of wedding websites recently, and I've noticed that each of them includes a section called Our Story. It tells a story about the couple and how they got to that day. But it's just a story, one story, a story that is constantly changing as the couple grows. Their story changes the day they get married, and as each new life adventure comes their way, and we cannot let a story hold us back. For each person, each relationship, and each community is made up of layers and layers of stories. This church has a story as well, and we also have a section of our website that tells it. But what is the story that you tell about this church? When someone asks you, "What is your church all about?" how do you respond? When Aaron and I asked this at the book study on Wednesday evening, the first responses that we heard were historical. We were founded over 100 years ago with the support of Temple Emmanuel. The Women's Alliance was key to sustaining the church during the hard years of the Depression, things like that. But we pressed them further. We asked them, what purposes does this church serve and why do we exist? Well, we said, the Reverend Daniel Limbaugh began the church as a haven of hope for those at sea without a chart or compass. Class participants said that this church meets a basic human need for caring community. We're a force for justice in Dallas. We are a oasis of religious liberalism in a conservative environment. We're a religious community where intellectual exploration and questioning are encouraged. Each Sunday, in the affirmation, we say that we do things. We love, we search for truth, we serve, we come together in fellowship, and we do this to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. These are the stories of this church. But what is yours? Each of us brings our stories to this place as well. The reading that is listed on your insert that I was going to share this morning by the Reverend Meg Barnhouse talks about the role of stories in ministry and in building a church. As ministers, we hear stories of family and work, loss and rejection, illness and healing, birth and death. We tell stories on Sundays, we teach and we challenge and we invite through stories. As she says, brick by brick, story by story, we build a church. We will never be finished. We will never be finished, and so we cannot get stuck in one story. We asked the class on Wednesday what impact they thought the stories that they tell about this church have on our church. Do they transform us? Do they inspire us to live in certain ways? Or do they cause us maybe sometimes to get stuck? Do we need to transcend or be released from some of our stories? I don't have an answer for you, but I encourage you to think about it. What do the stories of this church call you to do and to be? We are here in the name of stories and their power to transform. It was something about your story, the story of this church, or the story of religious tradition that drew you here and that keeps you here. I know the power of stories to connect and to change people, and I bet you do too from your lives. Neil Gaiman, the writer and graphic novelist, said that we owe it to each other to tell stories. So let's share our stories, connect with each other, allow them to move us forward and to be transformed, because we need the soul of stories. Tell them, listen to them, hold them, and release them. Amen.